The winter night pressed down upon Wyoming like an endless ocean of ice, each gust of wind a wave that threatened to pull the breath from her lungs. Snow swirled through the empty train yard, settling on wooden beams and iron tracks until even the outlines of the world blurred into whiteness. And there, upon a weathered bench, Elizabeth Montgomery sat wrapped in a shawl too thin for such merciless cold. Her lips trembled a shade of blue, her hands numb and aching, her heart heavy with all that had been stripped from her life. She carried only a small leather bag, and inside it 3 crumpled dollars, a photograph long faded, and the last fragile thread of her hope. It was supposed to be a journey westward toward a new beginning, but the storm had trapped her in Cheyenne, stranded between the world she had fled and the one she longed for. The last train was gone. The next would not come until morning. She was alone. The boarding house had turned her away. The streets were silent, but for the howling of the wind. Around her, the town seemed abandoned to winter's cruelty. It would have been so easy to surrender, to close her eyes and let the storm carry her away. Yet something inside her refused. Some quiet flame of courage that would not let despair claim her completely. She had been trained to heal, to stitch wounds, to soothe fevers, to cradle infants as they drew their first uncertain breaths. But no training had prepared her for the ache of betrayal that had driven her from Philadelphia. That shameful scandal, whispered behind hands and passed from ear to ear, had stolen not only her career, but her very place in the world. She had defended herself against a man's cruelty, and for that she had been punished, cast out, forgotten. And now the silence of the prairie night pressed against her ears, asking if perhaps she had made a mistake to believe there could be life after ruin. Snow gathered in her hair, glimmering like frozen pearls under the dim lantern light of the station. Her shawl clung damp against her shoulders. She drew the bag close, as though its contents were enough to guard her against the emptiness around her. The bitter air cut through every layer she had, gnawed at her bones, left her trembling, until even thought itself came in fragments. She whispered prayers into the storm, not knowing if heaven still listened, not knowing if anyone still cared. Her breath rose in fragile clouds and vanished into the dark, as fleeting as every dream she had once cherished. And yet, through the veil of snow, came the faint sound of hooves striking frozen ground. At first, it seemed a trick of her weakening senses, a phantom rhythm conjured by her fading hope. But then it grew louder, steadier, echoing across the wooden platform. She lifted her head, straining against the blur of wind and ice, and saw a figure emerge from the storm. A rider. A man cloaked in a heavy coat, hat pulled low against the blizzard, astride a black stallion that cut through the snow like a shadow carved of strength. He rode not with hesitation but with certainty, as though no force of winter could sway him. Something in her heart stirred, half fear, half the longing of one too long alone. The stranger dismounted, his boots crunching upon the icy ground, and tied his horse with steady hands. When he stepped forward, pushing open the door of the station, the wind followed him inside, carrying with it the raw scent of snow and pine and leather. His voice broke the silence with warmth that seemed impossible in such a night. "Evening, miss," he said gently, touching the brim of his hat. Elizabeth tried to reply, but her teeth chattered too violently, her words lost in the tremor of her body. She only managed a nod, her eyes fixed upon the kindness she glimpsed in his face. His features were weathered by sun and time, but his eyes, dark and steady, held a tenderness that unsettled her guard. For so long she had met nothing but cruelty and suspicion. And now, when she was at the edge of surrender, there appeared a man who looked at her not with judgment, but with genuine concern. He studied the bag at her side, the threadbare quality of her clothes, the shadow of despair in her posture. And in that instant, though she did not yet know his name, something shifted in the night. A stranger had stepped out of the storm. A stranger who might hold the power to change the course of her life. And though she did not yet understand it, though her body still shivered and her heart still hesitated, she felt the first fragile spark of warmth, like a healing touch, brushing across her weary soul. It was the beginning of something that would be remembered, told, and cherished, long after the snow had melted, long after their footsteps had faded from the wooden planks of that lonely station. And if you, dear listener, feel even the faintest stirring in your own heart tonight, let this story remind you that love can arrive in the most unexpected of storms. Share your thoughts below. Let your words join this tale, and stay close for the chapters yet to come. For stories like this are meant to be heard, meant to be carried forward, meant to heal. If the warmth of this beginning has touched you, leave a comment and subscribe, so that together we may keep the fire of these timeless romances burning bright against every winter's night. He moved closer, the weight of his presence both steadying and disarming. Snow clung to the brim of his hat and melted into rivulets across his coat, but his stride was certain, measured, like a man accustomed to storms both of weather and of life. Elizabeth's heart faltered in its weary rhythm, beating against the icy ache in her chest, as though urging her to rise, to believe, to hold on just a little longer. He knelt before her, close enough that she could see the gentleness beneath the rugged lines of his face. His hands, though broad and calloused from years of labor, moved with surprising care as he drew off his gloves. Without hesitation, he slipped out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Warmth, real, immediate, undeniable, flooded through the wool. It carried the faint fragrance of leather, smoke, and pine, the unmistakable scent of a life lived in open skies and untamed lands. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to surrender to the relief, the way his simple gesture seemed to soothe not only her frozen body, but also something far deeper, something bruised and silent inside her soul. "You can't remain here." His voice resonated low, steady, as though he was speaking not only to her ears, but to the despair threatening to drown her. He offered his arm, yet when she tried to stand, her legs faltered beneath her, too stiffened by the cold. Without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. Shock rippled through her, not from fear, but from the sudden, unfamiliar sense of safety. For so long, she had relied only on herself, fought only for herself, and now, carried against the chest of this stranger, she felt a healing calm settle over her like a balm against every wound. The storm lashed at them as he stepped out of the station, but she pressed closer into the shelter of his embrace. The world blurred into a whirling veil of snow, yet his arms remained steady, his stride unbroken. Across the street, lantern light glowed from the windows of the cattleman's hotel, promising fire and food and life. When he crossed the threshold, the warmth inside struck her like sunlight after endless night. Conversations hushed, eyes turned, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the way he carried her past curious stares, as though she were precious, not pitiful, as though her dignity remained intact despite her ragged condition. He ordered a room with the authority of a man accustomed to command, yet every word carried respect, every glance at her measured with kindness. Soon she was placed before a roaring fire, wrapped in blankets, a cup of steaming coffee pressed gently into her hands. The heat burned her lips, her throat, but the pain was healing pain, the kind that meant life was returning. She caught her reflection faintly in the polished glass of the window, a woman, pale, trembling, fragile. But in his gaze, steady, unwavering, she saw not fragility, but resilience. He looked at her as though he could already see the strength she had nearly forgotten she possessed. When she managed to speak her name, her voice trembled as much from the weight of memory as from the cold. Elizabeth Montgomery, nurse from Philadelphia. He repeated it softly, almost reverently, as though committing it to memory. His own name followed. Jackson Thornton, though he told her to call him Jack. A rancher, he explained, with land stretching far beyond the snowbound horizon. The Double T Ranch, he called it, but in his tone there was no arrogance, only quiet pride, the kind born not from wealth, but from hard years and honest toil. The fire crackled between them, and with it a silence that was not uncomfortable but full, alive, almost tender. She told him fragments of her story, how she had lost everything to a lie, how she had been driven west by necessity rather than choice. He listened without interruption, his jaw tightening, his eyes darkening with unspoken anger at the injustice she had suffered. Yet when she faltered, afraid of what her confession might reveal, his words flowed like balm, that here in the wide lands of Wyoming, people were measured not by whispered rumors, but by their deeds. That her courage, her skill, her heart, these were what mattered. She had not realized until that moment how desperately she had needed to hear such words. The warmth of the fire wrapped around her, but it was his voice that truly thawed the frozen corners of her spirit. Something fragile stirred, a pulse of belief that maybe she was not broken beyond repair, that maybe she still had a place in this vast, untamed world. When a maid arrived with clothing, simple but clean, donated by strangers, moved to kindness, Libby felt tears prick at her eyes. Jack turned away discreetly, giving her privacy without being asked, his respect more eloquent than any promise could have been. She changed into the borrowed garments, her body no longer shivering, her spirit no longer hollow. When she emerged, he was waiting just outside the door, as steadfast as the mountains beyond the snow. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt the faint glow of safety, not because her circumstances had changed completely, but because she was no longer entirely alone. She looked at him then, really looked, at the lines etched into his face by sun and wind, at the strength that radiated from him, and at the gentleness that softened his gaze, and something deep within her whispered that this meeting was not chance, not mere accident born of a storm. It was the beginning of a path neither of them had foreseen, a path that might lead to healing, to hope, to a love as vast and unyielding as the land itself. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, in the quiet glow of firelight, the first chapter of their story unfolded, subtle, fragile, yet powerful enough to change the course of two lives forever. And though neither spoke it aloud, both felt the truth settle warmly between them, that sometimes salvation arrives not in the form of miracles, but in the unexpected kindness of another soul. If this warmth has touched you as it touched her, let your heart linger here. Share a thought, offer a word below, and stay with this story as it unfolds. In love, in healing, in faith, there is always more yet to come. Like, comment, and let the light of this journey continue to glow across the nights of your own life. Morning arrived with sunlight spilling across the frost-rimmed window panes, casting golden warmth upon the room where Elizabeth had slept in peace for the first time in what felt like years. The storm had passed, leaving Cheyenne wrapped in a clean silence, every rooftop and every fence post cloaked in dazzling white. She stretched beneath the borrowed blankets, the fire now only embers, her body still carrying the memory of safety that had wrapped around her like the coat Jack had placed upon her shoulders the night before. For the first time since her exile from Philadelphia, she awoke not with dread, but with the gentle hush of possibility. A knock came, light but sure. She rose quickly, smoothing the simple wool dress the maid had left her, braiding her hair with fingers still clumsy from months of strain. When she opened the door, Jack stood with a tray balanced easily in his hands. The scent of bacon, warm biscuits and coffee drifted into the room like a blessing. He smiled, and that smile, honest and unguarded, stirred a strange flutter inside her chest, as though something long dormant had remembered how to move again. He set the tray upon the table and poured her coffee, his hands steady, his voice unhurried as he asked after her strength. She thanked him with a quiet sincerity that needed no embellishment. Yet gratitude was not enough to explain what pulsed within her, the sense that this man was more than chance, more than circumstance. He was an answer to a prayer she had scarcely dared whisper. They ate together, while the city beyond the glass awakened under its blanket of snow. He told her of his ranch, the Double T, sprawling across 50,000 acres north of Cheyenne, where cattle roamed, horses thundered, and the work was hard but honest. He spoke with a steady pride that was never boastful. When she confessed her plan of seeking work in the mining towns, he shook his head gently. Those camps were dangerous, he warned, full of men hardened by isolation and thirsting for anything that might dull the sharp edge of their days. He did not tell her she could not go. He told her only that she deserved better. Then he offered something she had not expected: a place, a role, a purpose. The ranch needed a healer, someone who could treat injuries, tend to the sick, bring knowledge to a land where such skill was rarer than gold. He asked her not out of pity, but out of respect for her abilities. His eyes held no shadow of doubt, no patronizing softness. He believed she could do it. And in the face of that belief, something inside her began to heal. For months she had been treated as a liability, a scandal, an outcast. Here was a man who saw her as capable, valuable, necessary. The offer left her silent for a moment, torn between suspicion and longing. She searched his face for deception and found only sincerity. His honesty was almost unsettling in its clarity. He promised her a cabin of her own, supplies, fair pay, and freedom from obligation. If anything more were ever to bloom between them, it would be by choice, not necessity. The way he spoke stripped away her defenses, not through pressure, but through respect. She had grown used to men demanding, taking, twisting her strength against her. Jack Thornton did none of these. He simply asked and waited, as if the decision belonged wholly to her. When she finally whispered that she would try, his entire expression lit with a warmth brighter than the fire. He extended his hand, roughened by years of labor, and she placed her own within it. A spark leapt between them, quiet but undeniable, as though the world itself had drawn breath and chosen this moment to stitch two lives together. She had come west believing herself shattered, yet in his eyes she saw not pieces but promise. By afternoon they rode north through the glistening wilderness, the snow-laden pines rising like guardians along the trail. Jack had insisted upon purchasing her boots, a coat, and gloves, dismissing her protests with a grin that softened the severity of the day. An advance, he called it, but she knew it was more. A gesture of care, of provision, of an unspoken vow that she would never again be left to face winter's cruelty alone. The air was sharp with cold, but the sky stretched endlessly above them, pure and blue after the storm. Elizabeth inhaled deeply, and for the first time in months, the act did not feel like a struggle. The land unfurled before her, wild and vast, every mile a reminder that the world was far larger than the wounds she had carried. And at her side rode the man who had pulled her from the brink of despair, his presence like a steady flame, warding off the lingering frost within her spirit. When the valley of the Double T finally came into view, she drew in her breath. The ranch spread like a small kingdom across the snow, the main house standing proud with its wide porch, smoke curling from chimneys, barns and corrals stretching outward in a rhythm of order and labor. Men paused in their work to lift their hats in greeting, curiosity bright in their eyes as they regarded the woman who rode beside their master. Jack introduced her with a simple declaration. "This is Miss Elizabeth Montgomery. She's our new nurse." Cheers and smiles rose among the men, genuine relief at her arrival, for already one of them approached with a hand bandaged clumsily, seeking her skill. In that moment, Elizabeth felt something awaken deep within her, a sense of belonging she had nearly forgotten existed. She dismounted, the crunch of snow beneath her boots steadying her, and offered to examine the injury. The men watched in quiet awe as her capable hands unwrapped the wound, cleaned it, bound it with gentle precision. Their trust was immediate, their gratitude unspoken yet unmistakable. She was not an outcast here. She was needed. She was valued. Later, when Jack showed her to the small cabin that would be her home, she stepped inside and found it warm, furnished, prepared as though someone had been waiting for her all along. In the adjoining room, shelves of medical supplies gleamed, instruments neatly arranged, a sanctuary of healing that surpassed even the charity hospital she had once served. Overwhelmed, she turned to him, words failing, but he silenced her protest with a simple truth. A good nurse was worth a fortune, and he had been waiting for her. That night, as the fire crackled within her new hearth, she sat with a cup of hot chocolate brought by his hand, the sweetness melting across her tongue like comfort long denied. Jack sat opposite her, his gaze steady, his voice quiet, confessing that he had sought her intentionally after hearing whispers of a trained nurse passing through town. He admitted, too, the attraction that had stirred within him from the first moment he had seen her at the station, yet he assured her that her place on the ranch was secure regardless of what feelings might ever grow between them. His honesty disarmed her more than any charm could have. She looked into his eyes and found no guile, no hidden threat, only the rare courage of a man unafraid to be sincere. and against the quiet rhythm of the fire, she allowed herself to admit what her heart already knew. The attraction was mutual. Outside, the winter night deepened, stars spilling across the sky in rivers of silver. Inside, warmth lingered not only in the flames, but in the silence between them, rich with all that had been spoken and all that remained unsaid. Elizabeth sipped her chocolate and felt healing seep into her bones, into her soul, until the wounds of the past seemed softer, their edges dulled by something far stronger than pain. And as the night carried them toward tomorrow, both knew that a new story had begun, woven not of despair, but of hope, not of isolation, but of connection. It was fragile, yet strong, gentle, yet enduring, like fire coaxed from embers in the heart of winter. Beyond the cabin walls, the Wyoming wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise of days to come, of challenges that would test them, of love that would grow in quiet strength. And in that whisper, Elizabeth felt the future calling, urging her forward, promising that the journey she had once feared was at last becoming a path toward home. Spring awakened across the Wyoming plains with a beauty that Elizabeth had never known back east. The snows melted into rivers that shimmered under the sun, and meadows bloomed with wildflowers, painting the land in hues of gold and violet. Each dawn she rose to the song of meadowlarks. Each evening she watched the horizon turn to fire as the sun sank behind the distant mountains. Her days were filled with tending to ranch hands who brought her their cuts, burns, and broken bones. And in the rhythm of her work she found healing for herself as much as for them. The men respected her, not because Jack told them to, but because they had seen with their own eyes how steady her hands were, how calm her voice could be when a boy's life hung by a thread. She was no longer the outcast whispered about in hospital halls. Here she was, Miss Libby, the nurse whose skill saved their limbs and eased their pain. They came to her not only for bandages, but for advice, for counsel, even for the comfort of her quiet presence. And each evening, when her duties were done, she would step outside her cabin to find Jack waiting, as though the day was incomplete until they had shared it with each other. Those evenings became her most cherished hours. They would sit on her porch, a lantern glowing between them, mugs of coffee or hot chocolate in their hands, speaking of everything and nothing. He told her of his dreams for the ranch, of the years he had built it from rough land into a kingdom of cattle and horses. She told him of Philadelphia, of her childhood wandering the corridors of charity wards, of the injustice that had driven her west. Their words wove a tapestry of trust, each thread binding them closer. Sometimes silence would fall, but it was not the silence of strangers. It was the deep, healing silence of two souls who no longer feared being alone. One evening, as the first buds opened on the cottonwoods, Jack's voice carried a gravity that made her still her hands. He told her of Rebecca, the woman he had once loved, his childhood sweetheart, the wife who had died too young from fever. The pain lingered in his eyes even as the years stretched between then and now. Elizabeth listened, her heart torn with compassion and an unfamiliar ache of jealousy, but she reached across and laid her hand upon his. Her touch was not a question, not a demand, but a quiet offering of presence, a way of saying she understood, and he need not carry the grief alone. In his answering gaze, she saw a truth that softened every scar. He was ready to live again, ready to open his heart not as a replacement for what had been lost, but as a man choosing love once more. Their bond deepened with every day, though both guarded it carefully, aware of the fragile balance between employer and nurse, between private longing and public duty. Yet love is not a thing that hides forever. It showed itself in the way his eyes sought hers across the yard, in the way her laughter returned when he teased her gently, in the way silence between them carried warmth instead of distance. The ranch itself seemed to sense it, the men smiling knowingly, Martha fussing with extra dishes when Jack visited Libby's cabin, even the foreman tipping his hat with a twinkle in his eye, as though he, too, had been waiting for this story to unfold. But love is often tested by trial, and their trial came swift as a summer storm. Lightning struck one restless evening, spooking a corral of horses. In the chaos, young Danny, barely 18, was trampled under their hooves. By the time they carried him to the bunkhouse, his chest was crushed, his breath ragged, his life balanced on the thinnest edge. Elizabeth's training rose like fire within her. She ordered hot water, clean sheets, light for the table. She steadied trembling hands, rallied panicked men, and laid Danny upon the boards as though the bunkhouse were her operating theatre. The hours that followed were a blur of blood and bone, of steady incisions and whispered prayers. She worked with a strength she did not know she still possessed, her hands guided not by fear, but by purpose. Jack had ridden for the doctor in Cheyenne, but by the time he returned with him, it was Elizabeth's work that had already drawn Danny back from death. When the boy's breathing steadied, when his colour returned, the cheer that rose among the men was like thunder echoing into the night. The doctor himself pronounced her skill as fine as any surgeon's, and in that moment Elizabeth Montgomery ceased to be a woman running from her past. She became the healer of the Double T, the heart of the ranch. Later, beneath the stars, Jack found her on her porch, her hands still trembling from exhaustion. He looked at her not with the admiration of a man for a skilled nurse, but with the fierce tenderness of a soul who knew he had found the one thing he had searched for without knowing it. His words spilled into the quiet night, that he loved her, that he could no longer pretend otherwise, that the sight of her saving Danny had shown him not just her skill, but her courage, her heart, her soul. She met his gaze, weary yet radiant, and whispered the truth she had guarded but could no longer deny. She loved him too. It was not the sudden, reckless passion of fleeting infatuation, but the deep, healing love born of shared burdens, of respect and trust, of two lives stitched together by kindness and resilience. When he kissed her beneath the wide Wyoming sky, it was gentle, reverent, the sealing of a vow that had already been spoken in their hearts. And though he asked her then to marry him, she asked for time, not because she doubted, but because she knew love was not fragile. It was patient, and it would wait. Yet even as she promised to think, her heart already knew the answer. The days that followed carried a different light. The men treated her not only as nurse, but as family, and whispers of the impending union spread across the territory with warmth rather than scandal. The land itself seemed to bloom in rhythm with their affection, each sunrise brighter, each evening softer, as though the very sky approved of the path they had chosen. And when June arrived and the ranch gathered beneath garlands of wild flowers, Elizabeth walked down an aisle of dirt and wood and honest smiles, her hand resting upon Tom Bradley's arm in place of the father she had lost. At the altar stood Jack, dressed in black, but shining with a joy that outshone every star above them. Their vows were simple, spoken with voices strong and certain, binding not only their hearts but their futures. The celebration lasted long into the night, filled with laughter, music, and the taste of a feast shared among friends who had become family. Yet the moment Elizabeth would never forget came when Danny, pale but alive, rose to his feet and lifted his glass toward her. His words trembled with gratitude, but they carried the weight of truth. She had not only saved his life, she had healed the heart of the ranch itself by bringing love to its master. As Jack drew her close beneath the lantern light, she leaned into his embrace and felt the world settle into place. The healing she had once thought impossible was now complete, not because her past had vanished, but because love had woven it into something stronger, something beautiful. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of summer grass, the laughter of cowboys, the gentle strains of a fiddle. In that moment, as she laid her head against her husband's chest, Elizabeth Montgomery knew she had found not only safety, not only belonging, but a love that would endure storms and seasons alike. The night shimmered with promise, leading them softly toward the chapters still unwritten, toward trials yet to come, toward a future that would test and strengthen them both. And as the stars crowned their first night as husband and wife, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to the heavens, for kindness, for second chances, for the healing power of love that had carried her from despair to destiny. The journey was not finished. It had only begun. And with Jack's hand holding hers, she stepped into it, unafraid. The summer sun rose high above the double T, spilling its warmth across rolling pastures where cattle grazed and horses lifted their heads with restless energy. For Elizabeth, now Mrs. Thornton, each day began not in fear or uncertainty, but in the quiet rhythm of partnership. She awoke beside Jack, the sound of roosters and the soft hum of morning wind through cottonwoods replacing the clamor of city streets and the whispers of hospital corridors. When she moved through the ranch yard, men tipped their hats with respect not only to their boss's wife, but to the healer whose hands had saved their brothers, their sons, their own flesh. Her cabin had given way to the main house, yet she kept her medical office alive, its shelves lined with instruments gleaming like promises, ready for the next cry for help. Marriage had not slowed her work. Instead, it deepened it. She still stitched wounds and set bones, but now she stood also at Jack's side as partner in the business of the ranch. She studied his ledgers at night, suggesting ways to stretch supplies, to rotate grazing, to keep the cattle stronger through lean seasons. Her mind, trained in precision and discipline, proved as keen in numbers as in medicine. Jack listened, valued her counsel, and never once treated her as less. Their union was not a cage, but a bond. Two strong souls standing shoulder to shoulder, equal in burden and joy. In the heat of July, news came of cholera in a nearby mining camp. Fear spread like smoke, for disease traveled faster than horses and claimed lives before help could arrive. Elizabeth did not hesitate. With Jack at her side, she rode into the camp, armed with herbs, boiled water, clean cloths, and the sheer strength of her will. The sick lay on cots in dim shacks, their skin clammy, their breaths shallow. She bent to each one, cooling fevered brows, whispering words of comfort, her presence a balm as vital as the medicines she carried. Jack worked beside her, hauling water, chopping firewood, holding men who trembled in delirium, until her healing touch steadied them. Together they turned despair into survival, and when the camp finally quieted, when the worst had passed, men lifted their hats, not just to the rancher, but to the woman who had braved death to save strangers. The story spread quickly, carried by riders and newspapers alike. Soon, Elizabeth was spoken of as far as Denver, not as a scandal, but as a miracle worker. She brushed aside the praise with humility, but Jack's eyes gleamed with pride every time her name was spoken with reverence. At night, when they returned to their ranch, weary and stained with the work of healing, he would gather her close beneath the lamplight and remind her that she was the heart not only of his life, but of the land itself. Seasons turned, and with autumn came new trials. A sheriff wounded in a gunfight arrived at their gates, bleeding heavily from a bullet lodged near his ribs. Elizabeth worked swiftly, steadying her hands even as the man's life waned. Jack stood behind her, a steady presence, offering silence and strength as she fought hour after hour. When at last the sheriff stirred, pale but alive, she leaned into Jack's arms, exhausted. His voice in her ear carried not only pride, but awe, as though he too could scarcely believe the gift she carried. Their love grew deeper in the quiet moments as much as in the storms. Evenings on the porch became rituals, she sewing or writing in her journal, he smoking his pipe or sketching plans for new barns, both wrapped in a silence that healed the weary edges of their days. Sometimes he would tell her of his youth, of his father's ships, and his own restless years in Texas. She would tell him of her childhood in the East, of books read by candlelight, of dreams she had thought forever lost. Each story woven into the night bound them tighter, a tapestry no storm could unravel. When the first snows of winter returned, it was not with dread, but with warmth. Their home was filled with laughter, the hearth glowing with fire, and the ranchmen gathered often to share stories, music, and the simple comfort of belonging. Elizabeth had become more than wife and nurse. She was the soul of the ranch, the one who turned cold nights into evenings of joy. Jack watched her with eyes that carried a tenderness so deep it seemed endless, as though every glance was a silent vow renewed. Yet even in happiness, shadows sometimes returned. Letters came from the East, whispers of Dr. Harrison, the man who had wronged her, stirring old fears. Jack stood firm, his arm a wall of protection, his voice steady with assurance that no one could harm her here. And though her heart trembled with memories, she found strength in his presence, in the way he never let her face those ghosts alone. Together they built not only a ranch, but a sanctuary, a place where the past could not claim her, where the healing she gave others reflected back upon her own soul. As spring came once more, so too did new life. Elizabeth carried their first child with the quiet grace of a woman who had once feared she would never know such joy. Jack hovered with protective care, yet his eyes shone with wonder more than worry. When the twins were born, a pair of strong, wailing sons, the ranch erupted in celebration. Cowboys cheered, Martha wept, and Jack, holding his sons for the first time, bent over his wife with tears streaking down his weathered cheeks. "Forever and always," he whispered, the vow etched deeper than the ring upon his hand. The children thrived, growing under the wide Wyoming sky, their laughter carrying across the fields like music. Elizabeth's days filled with tending not only to ranch hands, but to her sons, her joy multiplied in every cry, every first step, every bright glance. The love between her and Jack grew stronger with each moment of shared parenthood. their nights often spent in quiet awe at the lives they had brought forth together. And yet, life on the frontier never remained still. There were more storms, more trials, more moments when her hands would be called upon to save a life, when Jack's strength would be tested against the weight of land and men. But each hardship only bound them closer, forged in fire and softened by the healing tenderness they gave one another. As the years stretched forward, the Double T flourished, the town nearby grew, and their story began to take on the shape of legend. Strangers would arrive at their gates, asking to see the nurse who had braved cholera, the cowboy who had built a kingdom, the love story that had begun with a freezing woman on a train station bench. Elizabeth would smile softly, her eyes drifting toward Jack, and know that no words could ever capture the truth, that healing, love, and courage were woven together so tightly in their lives that one could not be spoken of without the others. And in the quiet of night, when the stars stretched like rivers across the sky, she would rest against Jack's chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and whisper her gratitude for the storms that had brought her here, for the wounds that had taught her strength, for the love that had healed her beyond all measure. And together they would drift into dreams, their souls entwined, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they had already found the greatest treasure of all. The journey stretched ever onward, carrying them toward trials yet untold, victories yet to be claimed, and joys yet to blossom. But the foundation had been set, unshakable. Two hearts, bound forever, building a life where healing flowed as naturally as breath, and love shone brighter than any storm that dared rise against them. The spring of 1889 brought not only blossoms and the laughter of children, but also shadows from the past that Elizabeth thought she had left buried in Philadelphia. Word arrived one morning in the form of a telegram delivered by a weary rider from Cheyenne. Jack unfolded the paper at the breakfast table, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the sharp words. Dr. Harrison, the man whose cruelty had driven Elizabeth from her career and her home, had come west. He claimed he was investigating malpractice by unlicensed practitioners. To Jack, the words were an insult. To Elizabeth, they were the echo of a wound not yet fully healed. Though her hands trembled as she held the telegram, she lifted her chin with quiet strength. She had faced storms fiercer than this, she told herself. And still, fear whispered in her chest. Not fear of losing her position. Jack had made it clear no man could strip that from her, but fear of having her past thrown into the light before all the people who had come to respect her. It felt as if the ground she had so carefully built might tremble beneath her feet. When Harrison arrived at the ranch days later, he brought with him a marshal and papers that bore the seal of territorial authority. His voice dripped with mock politeness, but his eyes carried the same venom Elizabeth remembered all too well. He addressed her as if she were a criminal, questioning her right to practice medicine, throwing words like moral turpitude into the air with the precision of a knife. For a moment the years fell away, and she was once again that woman in Philadelphia, cornered by lies and stripped of her dignity. But before despair could claim her, Jack stepped forward. His presence was like a wall of stone, unyielding and immovable. His voice carried across the yard, calm but burning with controlled fury, as he told Harrison that his wife was a trained nurse whose worth had been proven not in titles or papers, but in the lives she had saved. The men of the ranch gathered, silent but steady, their very presence a show of loyalty. Even the marshal, shifting nervously under the weight of 30 hardened cowboys, seemed uncertain. Harrison sneered, but his bravado faltered when Jack's fist found his jaw, sending him sprawling in the dust. The marshal's hand twitched toward his gun, but the sight of so many men standing united for Elizabeth stilled him. The matter was taken to Cheyenne for a proper hearing. The courthouse filled with ranchers, townsfolk, miners, and cowboys, people whose lives Elizabeth had touched with her healing hands. One by one they rose to speak. A foreman whose broken leg she had mended, a young cowboy whose crushed chest she had saved, a miner who had lived through the cholera outbreak because of her courage. Even the doctor from Cheyenne testified, praising her skill as finer than any he had seen west of the Mississippi. Their words wove together a tapestry of truth that no accusation could tear apart. Harrison's own past came to light under questioning. His dismissal from the hospital back east for drinking, his reputation of incompetence, his long-standing grudge. His words withered under the weight of testimony, and in the end the judge's gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo across the territory. Elizabeth's certificates were recognized officially. She was authorized to practice medicine throughout Wyoming. Harrison was dismissed with cold disdain, warned to leave the territory before the people decided to mete out their own justice. When Jack lifted Elizabeth into his arms in the courthouse yard, spinning her as cheers erupted, she felt not only vindication but rebirth. The ghosts of Philadelphia had been laid to rest. She was no longer a woman defined by scandal, but by courage, by skill, by love. That night, as they celebrated in the glow of lanterns and the warmth of their friends, she leaned against Jack's chest and whispered that together they could face anything. He kissed her forehead and told her he had never doubted it. In the years that followed, their love grew into legend. By 1892, the Double T had doubled in size, stretching across valleys and rivers, a kingdom of cattle and horses renowned throughout the West. But it was not the wealth that made them beloved. It was the way they gave back to the land and the people. Elizabeth founded a small hospital in Cheyenne, the first of its kind, its doors open to miners, ranchers, women and children who had nowhere else to turn. She established a school for nurses, teaching young women not only the art of medicine, but the strength of compassion. Her students carried her healing touch into distant towns, spreading her legacy like seeds across the frontier. Jack's influence grew as well. He was elected to the territorial legislature, his voice steady in debates, always standing for fairness and progress. He advocated for statehood, for schools, for railroads that would tie Wyoming to the wider world. Yet no matter how far his responsibilities stretched, he always returned home to the ranch, to the wife whose presence was his anchor, to the children who carried his laughter into every corner of the house. Their twins, Thomas and Jackson Jr., grew quickly under the wide sky, their hands already strong from helping with chores, their hearts softened by their mother's teachings. Elizabeth saw in them the perfect blend of father and mother, courage tempered with compassion, strength softened by tenderness. When their daughter Rebecca was born, Jack's eyes filled with tears. Named with Libby's blessing for his first wife, the child became the living embodiment of healing. Proof that love does not diminish when shared, but multiplies. Life was not without hardship. There were harsh winters, long droughts, the ever-present danger of rustlers and accidents. Yet through it all, Jack and Elizabeth stood together. When cattle were lost, they rebuilt. When storms tore roofs from barns, they repaired them side by side. When sorrow touched their neighbours, Elizabeth was there with her steady hands, Jack with his unyielding strength. Their love became not just a bond between two souls, but a light that others leaned upon, a reminder that even in a land as wild as Wyoming, tenderness could thrive. Years passed, and their story spread far beyond the borders of the ranch. Newspapers wrote of the millionaire cowboy and his nurse bride, of the night he had found her freezing at a train station and carried her into a life that would inspire generations. Travelers came to see the Double T, to meet the woman whose healing touch had saved so many, to shake the hand of the man who had turned fortune into a force for good. Their names became legend, whispered by campfires and recorded in books, the living proof that love could change not only hearts, but history. And yet, within the walls of their home, they remained simply Jack and Libby. He would still bring her hot chocolate on cold evenings, still sit with her on the porch as the stars unfurled across the heavens. She would still rest her head against his shoulder, still listen to the steady rhythm of his heart, and know that it was the truest sound she had ever known. Their children's laughter filled the rooms, their love filled the silence, their legacy grew with every life they touched. As one season slipped into another, Elizabeth often found herself reflecting on the journey that had carried her from despair to destiny. She would stand at the window, watching her children play, and remember the bench in Cheyenne where she had thought her life was ending. She would turn to find Jack watching her, his eyes filled with the same unwavering tenderness as that first night, and she would know with certainty that storms are not always endings. Sometimes they are beginnings, sweeping away what must be left behind to reveal what waits ahead. And so the days continued, each one another thread in a tapestry woven with trials and triumphs, with healing and hope, with love so enduring it seemed to echo in the very wind across the plains. Their story was far from over, but already it was legend. Already it was proof that the greatest treasures of life are often found in the most unexpected places. Beyond the ranch, the cottonwoods whispered in the evening air, carrying with them the promise of more seasons, more healing, more love yet to unfold. And as Elizabeth laid her hand in Jack's, she felt again the warmth that had first saved her, the warmth that would carry them into every tomorrow. The years between 1892 and the turn of the century unfolded like a long summer's afternoon, full of labour and laughter, trials and triumphs, woven together into a life richer than Elizabeth had ever dared imagine on that frozen night in Cheyenne. The Double T Ranch expanded across valleys and rivers until its fences seemed to stretch toward the horizon itself. Yet even as the land grew, so too did the intimacy of the family at its heart. Elizabeth walked the halls of the home she and Jack had built, children's voices echoing like music against the timber beams. Thomas and Jackson, Jr. had grown into strong young men, their shoulders broad, their steps steady, each carrying both their father's grit and their mother's quiet compassion. They rode across the fields with confidence, one already leaning toward politics, the other drawn to medicine, their futures shimmering with promise. Little Rebecca, with her gentle eyes and steady hands, reminded Elizabeth of herself as a girl. Only this child would never have to face the storms of cruelty and shame that had nearly broken her mother. Surrounded by love, she bloomed as freely as the wild flowers that dotted the meadows in June. Elizabeth's work expanded far beyond the ranch. Her hospital in Cheyenne, once a modest building, now bustled with patients from every corner of Wyoming. She trained nurses who carried her healing knowledge to distant mining towns, logging camps, and homesteads where a single bandage or gentle hand could mean the difference between despair and hope. She often traveled to the city, lecturing to eager students, her voice steady, her heart rooted always in the lessons of compassion she had learned through suffering. Yet no matter how far she journeyed, her place was always at Jack's side. He would ride out to meet her carriage on the road, lifting her down as though she was still the woman he had once carried from a train station bench, precious and irreplaceable. Jack himself grew into more than a rancher. His voice carried weight in the legislature, his influence stretching beyond cattle markets and into the very future of Wyoming. But to Elizabeth, he was never the politician or the figure whispered about in saloons and newspapers. He was the man who brought her hot chocolate on winter nights, the man who leaned against the porch rail with her as the stars wheeled overhead, the man whose laughter still carried the unguarded warmth of youth whenever their children teased him at supper. Their love endured storms, economic downturns, droughts, the whispers of those envious of their fortune. Yet none of these could shake the bond they had forged. Whenever the world pressed too hard, they would walk together across the fields, the grass swaying around them, and in the quiet rhythm of their steps, healing would come. Their love was not fragile. It was a force, like the rivers that cut through the plains, carving valleys of life even through the hardest stone. One spring afternoon, Elizabeth stood upon the porch of their home, the air fragrant with lilacs, and watched Jack playing with their grandchildren. Thomas had married young, and his wife had given birth to a son whose laughter carried like bells. The sight of Jack, grey now at the temples yet still strong, lifting the boy high into the air, filled her with a joy so deep it brought tears. She had once feared she would die alone, forgotten, her name erased by lies. Instead, here she stood, surrounded by a family born not only of blood, but of resilience and love. Yet even joy is not free of sorrow. There were moments when loss brushed against their lives, the death of a ranch hand in an accident, the passing of old friends whose names had been written in the story of their beginnings. Each grief was met with tenderness. Elizabeth would sit by the grieving, her hands warm, her voice low, offering the healing comfort of presence. Jack would ride miles through storms to stand by those in need, his word and his arm alike steady. Together they reminded all who knew them that sorrow was never born alone, and that healing was not only for wounds of flesh, but for hearts wearied by the weight of living. By the dawn of the new century, the Double T was no longer merely a ranch. It was a community, a town in its own right, with a schoolhouse, a church, a store, and homes for the families who had chosen to tie their lives to the Thorntons. Thornton, Wyoming, they called it, and though Jack often protested, insisting the name belonged not to him but to the people, Elizabeth knew the truth. It was their love, their courage, their willingness to face storms together that had built this place, and no one could deny it. Elizabeth often walked through the town, greeted by waves and smiles, children calling her Mrs. Thornton with bright affection. She visited mothers in childbirth, stitched wounds from mining mishaps, calmed frightened children with lullabies. Each act reminded her that the healing she gave was not her own alone. It was the gift of every hand that had supported her, every soul that had believed in her when the world tried to silence her. It was Jack's strength, her children's laughter, the memory of every life she had saved, stitched into a single fabric. At night, when the day's work was done and the world fell into quiet, she would lie beside Jack and feel his arm draped around her, his breath steady against her hair. In those moments, time seemed to slow, the years folding into one another until she was again that half-frozen woman rescued from despair, her life rewritten by a stranger's kindness. She would close her eyes and whisper a prayer of gratitude, not only for what had been given, but for what had been healed, what had been redeemed. The legend of their love spread far beyond Wyoming. Writers traveled west to capture it, preachers told it from pulpits as proof of providence, and lovers whispered it to one another under starlit skies. Yet for Jack and Elizabeth, the legend mattered little. What mattered was the touch of his hand upon hers, the way her laughter still lit his eyes, the comfort of their family gathered at the table, the peace of knowing that love had conquered everything meant to destroy them. And as the century turned, with the world rushing forward into new inventions, railroads and cities brimming with change, their hearts remained rooted in the soil of Wyoming, in the healing truth that love is not fragile when it is built upon trust, respect, and unyielding devotion. Each day was a continuation of that night in Cheyenne, a night when a man had offered warmth to a stranger, and in return found a home for his soul. The winds whispered across the plains, carrying with them the scent of grass, the sound of cattle, the laughter of children, and the memory of all that had been overcome. Their story was not finished, but already it was etched into the land itself, a reminder that healing is found not only in medicine but in love, and that sometimes the greatest miracles begin with the simplest of gestures, the reaching out of one hand to another in the heart of a storm. And in the quiet glow of their home, beneath skies painted with stars, Elizabeth rested against Jack, her heart full. She knew there were still chapters to be lived, seasons of joy, seasons of trial. But whatever they faced, they would face it together. For together was where healing dwelled, where love endured, where forever truly began. The autumn of their lives arrived with a gentleness that neither Jack nor Elizabeth had dared to imagine in their youth. The days no longer carried the urgency of building, expanding, or proving themselves. Instead, each sunrise felt like a gift, each sunset a hymn of gratitude. Their children were grown, their grandchildren filled the halls of the ranch with laughter, and the town of Thornton thrived beyond even Jack's most ambitious dreams. To walk its streets was to walk through the living echoes of their love, families building homes, young women training as nurses, ranch hands raising their own herds, all of them bound by the quiet legacy of two people who had once chosen kindness in the midst of a storm. Elizabeth often stood on the porch in the evenings, wrapped in a shawl, as the Wyoming wind whispered through the cottonwoods. She would watch Jack moving across the yard, slower now, his hair silvered, his steps deliberate, but still carrying that quiet authority that had defined him all his life. When he caught her watching, he would tip his hat with the same boyish grin he had worn the night they met. And her heart, even after decades, would still skip as though she were that desperate woman at the train station, rescued by warmth when all seemed lost. Time had aged them, yes, but it had also softened them, carved them into something more enduring than youth, a love that had weathered every storm and only grown deeper. The house they had built became more than a home. It became a sanctuary. Travelers still came, curious about the legend of the millionaire cowboy and the nurse who had made history. Elizabeth welcomed them not with grandeur, but with tea, stories, and the gentle, healing presence she had carried all her life. She showed them her medical bag, worn but treasured, displayed now in a place of honor. She would smile as she told how it was all she had carried that night and how it had been enough. Jack would often join, his hand finding hers as if to remind her, and the visitors, that the true treasure was never the instruments or the wealth, but the choice they had made to walk forward together. As the years slipped into the 1920s, their strength began to wane, but their bond grew only stronger. Jack's hands, once powerful on the reins of a stallion, now trembled slightly as he held his grandchildren on his knee. Elizabeth's back bent with age, but her voice remained soothing, her touch still carrying that healing calm that had saved countless lives. They leaned upon one another, not out of weakness, but out of trust, the way two branches intertwine and hold steady even when the wind rises. When Jack passed quietly in the spring of 1923, at the age of 86, the land itself seemed to mourn. Cowboys removed their hats, bells rang in Cheyenne, and newspapers from Chicago to San Francisco carried the story of his passing. Yet to Elizabeth, none of that mattered. What mattered was the empty chair at the hearth, the silence beside her in bed, the absence of the hand that had steadied her through every season of her life. She lingered only 3 months before following him, her heart unwilling to continue without the man who had been her anchor, her partner, her healing. They were buried together beneath the Wyoming sky, side by side as they had lived, their headstone etched with the words, "Forever and Always." And the legend of Jack and Elizabeth Thornton became more than a story. It became a touchstone for generations. Couples who faced hardship told it to remind themselves that love could endure. Children listened to it as a bedtime tale, learning that kindness could change lives. Travelers visited their graves and left flowers, whispering prayers that their own lives might carry such devotion. Decades passed, yet the story did not fade. The Double T remained a thriving ranch, tended by their descendants who carried not only their blood, but their values. The hospital Elizabeth founded grew into a great medical center, her nursing school training women who spread healing across the frontier and beyond. Thornton became a city, its streets alive with commerce and culture, its heart still beating with the legacy of the love that had built it. But the truest monument to their lives was not carved in stone or written in history books. It lived in the quiet choices of ordinary people, in the rancher who paused to help a stranger, in the nurse who stayed by a patient's bedside through the night, in the husband who held his wife's hand even when the world pressed hard against them. For what Jack and Elizabeth had proven, through years of trial and triumph, was that love is not fragile but enduring, not passive but powerful, not fleeting but eternal when rooted in respect and compassion. Even now, more than a century later, visitors to Wyoming can walk through the old station at Cheyenne, can tour the preserved ranch house, can see Elizabeth's leather bag in the museum. But the real treasure cannot be touched or displayed. It lingers in the air, in the way the wind sighs through the cottonwoods, in the way the stars shine bright above the plains, in the way the heart feels a little stronger, a little warmer, simply by hearing their story. It is a healing that transcends time, the healing of knowing that love, true love, has the power to outlast even death. And so their tale continues, not just as history, but as a living reminder that kindness offered in a storm can grow into a legacy that spans generations. Jack and Elizabeth Thornton will forever stand as proof that the greatest treasures are not found in gold or land, but in the devotion of two souls who choose each other again and again until their final breath. If this story has warmed your heart, if it has reminded you that healing and love can grow even from the coldest nights, I invite you to let it live on. Leave a comment with your thoughts, share it so that others may feel its light, and subscribe so more timeless tales of courage and devotion may find you. Your presence keeps these stories alive, carrying their warmth into new hearts, just as Jack and Elizabeth once carried each other through the storm into forever.